What I witnessed in those October woods of 1962 defies everything I thought I knew about the world. Even now, as I write these words with trembling hands, I can still hear the sounds, the bone-chilling howls, the thunderous crashes, the primal fury of two creatures locked in mortal combat. My name is Cole Dawson, and in October of 1962, I was 23 years old, naive as a newborn calf, and absolutely convinced that the world was about to end. Those were dark days. The Cold War wasn't just headlines, it was a suffocating dread that pressed down on every American's shoulders. We'd all seen the news back then, and we knew that somewhere across the ocean, the Soviets had their own arsenal of nuclear nightmares pointed straight at our hearts. Then came October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis hit like a sledgehammer. Air raid sirens being tested in every major city. The whole damn world holding its breath, waiting to see if we'd all wake up the next morning or if civilization would end in a blinding flash of atomic fire. I remember sitting in my cramped Chicago apartment watching those grainy images of Soviet ships steaming toward Cuba and feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This was it. This was how it would all end. That's when I made the decision that would change my life forever. If the world was going to burn, if society was going to crumble into radioactive ash, then I needed to be ready. I needed to know how to survive when there were no grocery stores, no hospitals, no warm beds or electric lights. I needed to know how to live like our ancestors did, off the land, away from the cities that would be the first targets when the missiles started flying. So I started training. Every weekend, I'd drive out to the forests of Wisconsin and Illinois, learning to build shelters, start fires with flint and steel, identify edible plants, and track game. I read every survival manual I could get my hands on, studied the habits of predators, memorized the signs that meant danger was near. By October, I'd spent 6 months honing my skills in the relatively tame forests near the city. But that wasn't enough. If I was going to truly test myself, I needed to go deeper, farther, into places where the hand of man hadn't tamed the wild. That's how I found myself planning a solo expedition into the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. It was a vast, trackless expanse of dense forest that stretched for hundreds of miles without a single road or settlement. The kind of place where a man could disappear forever and never be found. It was perfect. I set out on a crisp October morning, my pack loaded with the bare essentials, a few days' worth of food, basic camping gear, my grandfather's, revolver, and a well-worn copy of the Army Survival Manual. Everything else I'd need, I planned to make or find along the way. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The forest was magnificent, a cathedral of towering pines and ancient oaks. I made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing beside a crystal clear stream. Using techniques I'd practiced dozens of times, I built a lean-to shelter, started a fire with flint and steel, and caught 3 brook trout for dinner. As I sat by my fire that night, watching the flames dance against the darkness and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what I was meant to do. This was how humans were supposed to live, not huddled in concrete boxes, terrified of invisible threats, but free and self-reliant. The second day was even better. I woke before dawn and spent the morning foraging for edible plants and mushrooms. I found wild onions, late-blooming blackberries, and several varieties of mushrooms that I was confident were safe to eat. For lunch, I made a hearty stew combining the mushrooms and onions with jerky from my pack. That second night, I camped in a grove of massive white pines that must have been growing there for centuries. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars, I felt more alive than I had in months. Out here, the Cuban Missile Crisis seemed like something from another world. For the first time since those terrifying days in October had begun, I slept soundly. It was on the third day that everything began to change. I woke that morning with an odd feeling I couldn't quite place. a sense that something was different. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the normal dawn chorus of birds muted and subdued. Even the stream seemed to babble more softly, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. As I broke camp and resumed my journey deeper into the forest, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like an itch between my shoulder blades, a constant awareness that I was being observed by unseen eyes. I'd learned enough about woodcraft to know the signs of predators in the area. When a bear or mountain lion was nearby, the smaller animals went silent. Birds stopped singing, and even the insects seemed to quiet their buzzing. But this was different. This wasn't the respectful silence that prey animals showed to a known predator. This was something else entirely. Around midday, I stopped for lunch beside a small pond, its surface mirror smooth and reflecting the brilliant autumn foliage. As I sat on a fallen log eating cold jerky and wild berries, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, searching for whatever was causing this inexplicable sense of unease. That's when I saw them, the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft mud at the water's edge, and at first glance I thought they might have been left by a man in bare feet. But as I knelt down for a closer look, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Each track was enormous, easily twice the length of my own size 10 boots, and proportionally wider. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them like a human's, but longer and more ape-like, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The heel was massive and rounded, and the arch was so pronounced it left a clear gap in the middle of each print. But it was the stride length that really shook me. Whatever had made these tracks had been taking steps that were at least 4 feet apart, suggesting a creature of incredible size and leg length. I knelt there beside that peaceful pond, staring at those impossible tracks, and felt my carefully constructed worldview begin to crumble. I'd studied enough animal tracking to know that these prints didn't match any known species. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. But deep down, in the most primitive part of my brain where instinct lived, I knew I was looking at something real. Something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. I spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound and constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now I knew why. Whatever had made those tracks was out there, somewhere in the dense forest around me, and it knew I was here. As evening approached, I selected my campsite with unusual care, choosing a small clearing that offered good visibility in all directions and positioning my shelter with its back against a large boulder. I built my fire larger than usual and gathered enough wood to keep it burning all night. But despite my precautions, sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig had me reaching for my gun and straining my eyes into the darkness. Several times throughout the night, I was certain I could see shapes moving between the trees. Massive, hulking silhouettes that seemed to be observing me from just beyond the edge of visibility. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, paranoid, and deeply shaken. But I was also more determined than ever to prove to myself that I could handle whatever challenges the wilderness might throw at me. How wrong I was. The 4th day brought a change in the weather that matched my increasingly dark mood. Heavy clouds had moved in during the night, blanketing the forest in a gray, oppressive gloom. The air was thick and humid, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain and something else. A musky animal odor that made my skin crawl every time I caught a whiff of it. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn back, to abandon this foolish expedition and return to the safety of civilization while I still could. But that would mean admitting defeat. It would mean accepting that I wasn't strong enough to survive on my own when the world came crashing down. So I pressed on, following a narrow game trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the gray daylight could barely penetrate to the forest floor. It was around noon when I found a second set of tracks, I'd stopped beside a small stream to refill my water bottle when I noticed them pressed into the soft clay of the bank. These were different from the first set, smaller but somehow even more disturbing. They were roughly canine in shape, like the paw prints of a large dog or wolf, but wrong in ways that made my brain rebel against accepting what my eyes were seeing. For one thing, they were enormous. Each print was easily as large as a dinner plate, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the clay. But it was the shape that really unsettled me. The basic structure was all wrong for a quadruped. The prints were too elongated, too narrow, and the pad structure suggested something that walked more on its toes than on the flat of its feet. Most disturbing of all were the occasional prints that showed all 5 toes clearly defined, spread wide like the fingers of a hand. No wolf or dog had feet like that. As I knelt there studying those impossible prints, a horrible realization began to creep over me. The spacing between the tracks, the depth of the impressions, the way they seemed to follow the stream bank in a purposeful, intelligent pattern. This wasn't just some unknown animal wandering randomly through the forest. This thing, whatever it was hunting. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It started as a low rumble, so deep and resonant that I felt it in my chest as much as I heard it with my ears. It rose gradually in pitch and volume, becoming a howl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the song of wolves, which I'd heard many times during my wilderness training. This was something far more primal, far more threatening. It spoke of intelligence and malice, of a predator that killed not just for food, but for the sheer pleasure of the hunt. The howl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the trees and rolling through the forest like thunder. As it finally faded away, leaving behind a silence so complete it was almost suffocating, I realized that every bird, every insect, every small animal in the forest had gone completely quiet. I was alone in the woods with something that even the wildlife feared. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to remain calm. Whatever was out there, running blindly through dense forest, would only make me easier prey. I decided to change course, to head back toward civilization rather than continue deeper into the wilderness. But as I shouldered my pack and started back along the game trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. Something was watching me from the shadows between the trees, something that had been tracking my movements for days, learning my habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I was walking right into its trap. The next few hours were a nightmare of paranoia and barely controlled terror. As I made my way back along the increasingly familiar trails, the sensation of being followed grew stronger with every step. I could hear things moving in the forest around me, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the soft pad of footsteps that seemed to mirror my own pace. But whenever I stopped to listen more carefully, the sounds would stop too. Whenever I spun around to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking me, I saw nothing but empty forest. The musky animal smell grew stronger as the afternoon wore on, carried on the humid air like a calling card from my unseen pursuer. It was a wild, primitive scent that spoke of something that had never known human civilization. By late afternoon, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in my peripheral vision had me spinning around with my hand on my gun. I was making too much noise, moving too fast, letting my fear override the careful woodcraft I'd spent months learning. As the sun began to set, I found myself approaching the clearing where I'd camped 2 nights before. I set up my shelter in the same spot, using the large boulder to protect my back and positioning my sleeping bag so I could see the entire clearing. I built my fire even larger than the previous night, creating a circle of light and warmth that I prayed would keep whatever was out there at bay. As darkness fell and the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, I sat with my back against the boulder, my revolver in my lap, and tried to convince myself that everything would be all right. But then, as the fire burned low and the shadows began to creep closer, I heard it again. The howl started the same way as before, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. But this time, it was closer, much closer. And as it rose in pitch and volume, filling the night air with its primal fury, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't alone. From somewhere to my left came an answering call, different in tone but equally terrifying. This one was higher in pitch, more aggressive, carrying a note of challenge that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded almost like a wolf, but wrong in subtle ways that my brain couldn't quite process. The two sounds seemed to circle around my campsite, calling and answering each other in a pattern that suggested intelligence, communication, coordination. Whatever was out there, they were working together, and I was the focus of their attention. I added more wood to my fire with trembling hands, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The shadows between the trees seemed to be moving, shifting, coalescing into shapes that my terrified mind tried desperately to convince me weren't really there. That's when I saw the eyes. They appeared first as tiny pinpricks of reflected firelight, hovering in the darkness at the edge of my vision. The eyes were huge, easily 3 times the size of any normal animal's, and they glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They were positioned too high off the ground to belong to any 4-legged creature, suggesting something that stood upright like a man but was far larger than any human had a right to be. As I stared in fascinated horror, the eyes moved, circling slowly around my campsite just at the edge of the firelight. I could catch glimpses of a massive shape behind them, something covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I raised my revolver with hands that shook so badly I could barely hold it steady, but I didn't fire. Something deep in my primitive brain was telling me that shooting now would be a mistake, that the only thing keeping me alive was the creature's curiosity. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we regarded each other across the dying fire. Predator and prey locked in a deadly standoff. The creature's eyes never left mine, studying me with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Finally, mercifully, the eyes began to move away, circling around behind my shelter and disappearing into the darkness beyond the boulder. But I could still hear it out there, moving through the forest with footsteps that were far too heavy to belong to any known animal. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat with my back against the boulder, feeding wood to the fire and listening to the sounds of something large moving through the darkness around me. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of those glowing eyes watching me from different positions. By the time dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, terrified, and more convinced than ever that I needed to get out of these woods before nightfall. Dawn came slowly to the forest, creeping through the canopy in gray, filtered light that did little to dispel the shadows or ease my terror. As the light grew stronger, I finally allowed myself to believe that I had survived another night. I broke camp quickly and efficiently, shouldering my pack and starting back along the trail that would take me out of this nightmare wilderness. My plan was simple. Hike hard and fast, covering as much ground as possible while the daylight lasted. But as I walked, following the increasingly familiar landmarks that marked my route back toward civilization, I began to notice something that made my blood run cold. There were more tracks now, pressed into the soft earth of the trail and the muddy banks of every stream I crossed. The massive bipedal prints I'd first discovered 3 days ago were everywhere, as if the creature that made them had been following my exact route through the forest. But now they were joined by the canine tracks I'd found beside the stream, dozens of them showing clear evidence that whatever made them had been running, moving with purpose and coordination. The implications were terrifying. Not only was I being stalked by 2 different creatures, but they seemed to be working together, coordinating their movements in a way that suggested intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal behavior. By midday, I was pushing myself harder than I had ever pushed before, driven by a primal terror that overwhelmed my exhaustion and hunger. I had to get out of these woods before whatever was stalking me decided that the game was over. But as I crested a small ridge and looked down into the valley below, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. In a small clearing beside the stream where I had first discovered those impossible footprints, two massive shapes were moving through the dappled sunlight. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing, tried to convince me that I was looking at bears or some other known wildlife. But as I crouched behind a fallen log and watched in fascinated horror, there was no denying the truth. The larger of the two creatures was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered from head to toe in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Its body was massively built, with shoulders that were broader than any human's and arms that hung down almost to its knees. But it was the face that truly marked it as something beyond nature, a blend of ape and human features that suggested intelligence lurking behind those dark, thoughtful eyes. But it was the second creature that truly made my blood freeze in my veins. Standing perhaps 6.5 feet tall on its hind legs, it was a nightmare fusion of wolf and man that seemed to have been pulled from the darkest folklore. Its body was lean and muscular, covered in coarse gray fur marked with darker patterns. The head was an elongated muzzle filled with gleaming fangs, pointed ears that swiveled constantly, and eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence that was far too human for comfort. As I watched in paralyzed fascination, the two creatures seemed to be engaged in some kind of communication. The massive, ape-like being would make low, guttural sounds that carried an unmistakable tone of intelligence, while the wolf thing would respond with soft growls and barks that were far too complex for simple animal communication. They were talking, planning, coordinating their actions like a military unit preparing for an assault. And then, as if responding to some unheard signal, both creatures suddenly went still. Their heads turned in perfect unison toward my hiding place, and I realized with growing horror that they had detected my presence. The wolf creature's lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed fangs like ivory daggers, while the ape thing's massive hands slowly clenched into fists that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. Then the wolf thing threw back its head and released a howl that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. What happened next was so far beyond my comprehension that even now, more than 60 years later, I sometimes wonder if it was all just an exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the scars on my memory are too deep, too vivid to be anything but real. The wolf creature's howl had barely begun to fade when it launched itself across the clearing, with a speed and ferocity that defied belief. Its powerful legs propelled it through the air in a leap that covered nearly 20 feet, its claws extended and its jaws gaping wide to reveal those terrible fangs. But the massive ape thing was ready for the attack. With reflexes that seemed impossible for something so large, it stepped aside and brought one huge fist around in a devastating uppercut that caught the wolf creature in midair and sent it tumbling across the clearing to crash into a tree with a sound like thunder. For a moment, I thought the fight might be over before it had truly begun. The wolf creature lay crumpled at the base of the tree, its body twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. But then it stirred, shook its massive head, and slowly climbed back to its feet with a snarl of pure rage. What followed was a battle that belonged in the realm of myth and legend. The two creatures circled each other like gladiators in some primordial arena, each looking for an opening, an advantage, a moment of weakness they could exploit. The ape thing had size and strength on its side, its massive frame and powerful muscles allowing it to deliver blows that would have killed any normal animal instantly. But the wolf creature was faster, more agile, and possessed claws and fangs that could inflict terrible damage even on its larger opponent. They came together again and again in a series of violent clashes that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The wolf creature would dart in, raking its claws across the ape thing's massive chest or attempting to sink its fangs into its throat, only to be met with a blow from one of those huge fists that would send it flying across the clearing. But each time the wolf creature was knocked down, it would get back up, more savage and determined than before. Blood began to flow from wounds on both combatants, bright red against the dark fur of the ape thing, darker where it matted the gray coat of the wolf creature. The sounds they made during the battle were unlike anything I had ever heard. The ape thing roared with a voice that shook the leaves from the trees, a sound that spoke of primordial rage and territorial fury. The wolf creature responded with howls and snarls that seemed to come from the very depths of nightmare. As the battle raged on, I began to realize that this was about more than just two predators fighting over territory. There was history here, old hatred and rivalry that ran deeper than simple animal competition. These creatures knew each other, had fought before, and the violence between them was personal. The turning point came when the wolf creature managed to get behind its larger opponent and leap onto its back, sinking its fangs deep into the thick muscles of the ape thing's neck. For a moment, it looked as though the battle might be over, but the ape thing was far from finished. With a roar of pain and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, it reached back with both massive hands and grabbed the wolf creature by the scruff of its neck. What happened next was a display of raw physical power that defied belief. The ape thing lifted its opponent clear off its back and, with a motion that was almost casual in its devastating efficiency, hurled the wolf creature through the air like a rag doll. The wolf creature's body struck a massive oak tree with such force that I could hear bones breaking from my hiding place 50 yards away. This time, when the wolf creature hit the ground, it didn't get back up immediately. It lay there for long seconds, its chest rising and falling with labored breathing, dark blood pooling beneath its massive head. The ape thing seemed to think the fight was over. Instead of pressing its advantage, it stood in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily and examining its wounds. Deep gashes from the wolf creature's claws crisscrossed its chest and arms, and there was a particularly nasty bite wound on its neck where dark blood was flowing freely. But then, with a sudden burst of speed that caught even the massive ape thing off guard, the wolf creature sprang back to its feet and launched itself in a desperate final attack. This time, instead of trying to grapple with its larger opponent, it went straight for the kill, leaping high into the air with its jaws gaping wide, aiming for the ape thing's throat. For a split second, it looked as though the attack might succeed. The wolf creature's fangs were mere inches from the ape thing's neck when those massive hands shot up and caught it in midair. What followed was a brief, violent struggle as the two creatures grappled for position. But the ape thing's superior size and strength finally told. With a final, tremendous effort, it managed to get both hands around the wolf creature's throat and began to squeeze. The wolf creature thrashed and clawed desperately, but its struggles grew weaker as the life was slowly crushed out of it. I thought I was about to witness the death of one of these impossible creatures when something unexpected happened. The ape thing, perhaps realizing that its opponent was on the verge of death, suddenly released its grip and stepped back. The wolf creature collapsed to the ground, gasping and choking, but still alive. For a long moment, the two creatures stared at each other across the torn and bloodied clearing. Then, without warning, the ape thing turned and walked away. It didn't run, didn't flee in panic. It simply turned its back on its defeated opponent and disappeared into the dense forest with a dignity that was almost human in its restraint. The wolf creature remained where it had fallen for several more minutes, gradually recovering its strength. When it finally managed to stand, it looked around the clearing with what seemed like confusion. Then it too limped away into the forest, moving in the opposite direction from the one the ape thing had taken. And suddenly I was alone. For several minutes after both creatures had vanished into the forest, I remained crouched behind my fallen log, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. My mind was reeling from what I'd witnessed, struggling to process the impossible reality of what had just occurred. I had just watched two creatures that shouldn't exist engage in a battle that belonged in the realm of mythology. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world had been shattered in the space of a few violent minutes. But as the minutes passed and neither creature returned, I began to realize that this might be my only chance to escape. I needed to get out of these woods, and I needed to do it now. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept out from behind my hiding place and began to make my way around the edge of the clearing. The evidence of the battle was everywhere. Torn earth, broken branches, pools of dark blood that gleamed wetly in the filtered sunlight. As I reached the far side of the clearing and prepared to plunge back into the forest, I made the mistake of looking back. There, pressed deep into the soft earth near where the wolf creature had fallen, was a single footprint that made my blood turn to ice. It was human, or at least it was close enough to human to be unmistakable. But it was wrong in subtle ways. Too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the tips of the toes that no human foot should possess. The wolf creature, I realized with growing horror, could walk upright when it chose to. And when it did, its feet left prints that could easily be mistaken for those of a very large, very strange human being. I turned away from that terrible footprint and plunged into the forest, no longer caring about stealth or woodcraft. All that mattered now was distance, putting as much space as possible between myself and this cursed place where impossible things stalked through the shadows. I ran through those woods like a man possessed, crashing through underbrush and splashing across streams without regard for the noise I was making. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught at my feet, and more than once I stumbled and fell, only to scramble back to my feet and continue my desperate flight. As the hours passed and the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion started to take its toll. But I forced myself to keep moving, driven by a terror that transcended mere physical discomfort. It was late in the afternoon when I finally stumbled out of the dense forest and found myself standing on the shore of a lake I recognized. I had made it back to within a few miles of where I had started my expedition 5 days earlier. But as I stood there on the muddy shore, gasping for breath and trying to process everything that had happened, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was distant, barely audible over the lapping of waves against the shore, but unmistakable. A howl, long, mournful, and filled with an intelligence that no natural wolf should possess. It was coming from the forest behind me, and it was getting closer. I didn't wait to see what might emerge from the trees. Summoning strength I didn't know I still possessed, I plunged into the cold water of the lake and began swimming toward the far shore. The weight of my waterlogged pack threatened to drag me under, but I didn't dare abandon it. My grandfather's revolver was still inside. The swim across that lake was one of the longest of my life, even though it couldn't have been more than a quarter of a mile. Every stroke was an agony of exhausted muscles and burning lungs. But somehow I made it to the far shore and dragged myself up onto the rocky beach. I lay there for several precious minutes, coughing up lake water and trying to summon the will to continue, when I heard something that made my heart stop. Splashing, coming from the direction of the far shore. I forced myself to look back across the water, and there, silhouetted against the setting sun, I could see a massive shape moving through the water toward me. It was swimming with powerful, purposeful strokes that covered the distance far faster than any human could manage. The wolf creature had followed me into the lake. I struggled to my feet and began running again, this time along a hiking trail that I knew would take me back to the parking area where I had left my car 5 days earlier. Behind me, I could hear the creature reaching the shore, could hear the sound of water streaming from its massive body as it pulled itself up onto the rocks. But I also heard something else, labored breathing, the sound of an animal that was badly injured and running on nothing but determination and predatory instinct. The battle with the ape thing had taken its toll. That realization gave me hope. If I could just stay ahead of it for another mile or two, if I could reach my car before it caught up with me, I might actually survive this nightmare. The trail wound through increasingly familiar territory, past landmarks I remembered from my journey into the wilderness. As twilight began to fall and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I could see the glow of electric lights in the distance. The small town where I'd left my car. I was almost there, almost safe. But as I crested the final hill and saw the parking area spread out below me, empty except for my dusty sedan, I heard the wolf creature howl again. This time it was close, very close. And there was something different about the sound, something that spoke of desperation and dying fury rather than confident predation. I reached my car just as the creature emerged from the tree line 50 yards behind me. In the pale light of the rising moon, I could see that it was badly injured. Its gait was unsteady, dark blood matted its gray fur, and one of its arms hung at an odd angle. But it was still coming, still determined to finish what it had started in those dark woods. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. Behind me, I could hear the creature's labored breathing getting closer, could hear its claws clicking against the asphalt. Finally, mercifully, the door opened, and I threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the first try, and I gunned it out of the parking lot just as the wolf creature reached the car. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it standing in the middle of the road, watching me flee with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Then I rounded a curve and it was gone, lost in the darkness behind me. I drove through the night like a man possessed, not stopping until I reached the outskirts of Minneapolis as dawn was breaking over the highway. Only then did I finally allow myself to believe that I had escaped. But as I sat in a truck stop diner, mechanically eating eggs and bacon while trying to process everything that had happened, I realized that telling this tale was going to be a problem. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that a young man from Chicago had witnessed a battle between a Sasquatch and what could only be described as a werewolf? I thought about my friends back home, about their reactions when I told them I was going into the wilderness to prepare for nuclear war. They had thought I was crazy then. What would they think if I came back with stories of monster battles? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that silence was the only option. Whatever those creatures were, wherever they had come from, they had earned the right to live their lives in peace, free from human interference. So I kept my mouth shut. I went back to Chicago, back to my job and my apartment and my normal life. I watched the Cuban Missile Crisis resolve itself without nuclear war. And I tried to convince myself that none of it had really happened, but the memories wouldn't fade. Night after night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing again those terrible howls echoing through the darkness. I would see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows, would feel again that primal terror of being hunted by something that viewed humans as prey. Years passed, decades. The Cold War ended, the world changed, technology advanced. But somehow, those deep woods of northern Minnesota remained as mysterious and untouched as they had been in 1962. Occasionally, I would see stories in the news about Bigfoot sightings or werewolf encounters, usually dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations. I would read the accounts with a mixture of recognition and sadness, knowing that somewhere out there were other people who had glimpsed the truth and found themselves unable to share it. Sometimes I wondered if I should have tried harder to tell my story, should have fought to make people believe. But then I would remember the intelligence in those creatures' eyes, the way they had seemed to communicate with each other, and I would know that I had made the right choice. Some secrets are meant to be kept, some truths are too dangerous to share, and some encounters with the unknown are meant to remain forever locked away in the deepest corners of human memory. Now, as I write these words in the twilight of my life, I can finally tell this story. Most of the people who might have been tempted to mount expeditions into those dark woods are long dead, and the creatures themselves have probably moved on to even more remote territories. I'm 85 years old, and the cancer is winning its war against my body. Soon, very soon, I'll be gone, and this story will die with me unless I find the courage to share it. So here it is, The truth about what happened in those dark woods of northern Minnesota in October of 1962. I've changed nothing, added nothing, hidden nothing. This is exactly what I saw, exactly what I experienced, exactly what has haunted my dreams for more than 60 years. I don't expect anyone to believe it. I wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told me such a story. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. And I know that somewhere out there in the deep places of the world, impossible things still walk beneath the stars. The Cuban Missile Crisis passed without nuclear war. The world didn't end in atomic fire. But for me, in those woods, something ended anyway. My naive faith that humans understood the world we lived in, that we had cataloged and classified everything that mattered, that we were the only intelligent life on this planet. I learned that we share our world with older things, stranger things, things that have learned to avoid us and our cities and our increasingly intrusive technology. They live in the spaces between our mapped territories, in the shadows of our surveillance, in the silence between our radio signals. And sometimes, very rarely, a human being stumbles into their world and glimpses truths that weren't meant for human eyes. I was one of those humans. For 5 days in October 1962, I walked in a world where legends were real and monsters fought their ancient battles beneath the autumn stars. I survived that encounter, but I was forever changed by it. Now, as my time runs short, I leave this record for whoever might find it. Take from it what you will, believe it or dismiss it as the ravings of a dying old man. But remember this, the world is stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than we imagine. And in the deep woods, where the old rules still apply and civilization is just a distant memory, impossible things still walk the earth. For more interesting stories like this, check this one out.